Hi, this is Dr. Kalman Kaplan. I want to speak to you today briefly about three plays that I've written and published with Within Stock on the story of Oedipus from a biblical point of view. It's probably the first trilogy in Oedipus that's been written since Sophocles 2,000 years ago, over 2,000 years ago. First play, Oedipus in Jerusalem, it's published and has been had a public reading up to this point. Um, in this play, the Hebrew prophet Nathan meets the blinded Oedipus on the outskirts of Thebes. Oedipus tells Nathan a story, and Nathan becomes convinced Oedipus is innocent of the crimes of intentional patricide and incest, as he did not know the identity of his father and mother and has actively tried to avoid committing both acts. Nathan brings Oedipus for a trial to the Jewish court of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, with the Greek playwright Sophocles serving as the accuser and Nathan himself as a defender of Oedipus, who is convinced he is guilty. The council of sages of the Sanhedrin acquit Oedipus on both charges because it concludes he is done in by fate, which actually is not something magical at all. Rather, these acts are judged to be the result of incomplete information, misleading riddles, and confusing statements, leaving Oedipus without accurate knowledge of his situation and thus entrapping him. A strong dialogue emerges between Nathan and the Oracle of Delphi, illustrating this point. Greek thinking is indicted as representing an abstract geometrical concoction rather than any organic morality inherent in biblical thinking. Oedipus is reprimanded for only one action, taking out his eyes, which is expressly forbidden in the Hebrew Bible and Jewish law as prohibited self-mutilation. As he has not been formally accused of this act by the Greek Sophocles or Tiresias, no punishment can be levied, though the Sanhedrin comments on the act of self-mutilation as being repulsive. Oedipus, however, thoroughly indoctrinated in Greek thinking, emotionally refuses to accept the verdict of innocence, shouting that he is the worst of the worst, guilty of the polluting acts of patricide and incest with his mother. And this is the way the first play ends. The second play, Oedipus Redeemed, Seeing Through Listening, takes up where this first play ends. Oedipus Redeemed focuses on Nathan and Sophocles combining forces to present Oedipus with two dialogues of historical biblical figures and Greek figures. The first dialogue contrasts the suicide of the Greek Zeno the Stoic after a minor mishap with his life, in contrast to the affirmation of life expressed by the biblical Job after monumental losses. In other words, Zeno kills himself after stubbing his toe because he interprets this as a sign from the gods he should depart, while Job never gives up his faith in a creator and able to withstand many, many monumental losses and ultimately is restored. This play is designed to uncover the possibility that Oedipus is experiencing shame rather than guilt. After all, he did not commit suicide after he blinded himself. He had blinded himself because he couldn't bear to see his parents in Acheron after his heinous acts. However, he could have killed himself after he blinded himself, but he didn't, showing that he did have some life force. Nathan and Sophocles focus on the secondary psychological benefit Oedipus has received from insisting on his guilt and is coming to terms with the fact that he had blinded himself needlessly if he was innocent. If he was innocent, why did he blind himself? The second dialogue between the biblical prophetess Deborah and the blind Greek seer Tiresias focuses on the biblical story of Samson being betrayed by following his eyes. Insight is contrasted with sight, saying that sight itself can lead someone astray. Samson, in the Hebrew account, is portrayed as following his eyes, going after forbidden women. Oedipus' daughter Ismene, who he thought was dead, reunites with Oedipus, telling him she loves him and needs him. The play ends with Oedipus' return to the Sanhedrin, where he tentatively and tearfully accepts his acquittal. The third play, which is just finished, Oedipus the teacher returns to Thebes. Oedipus returns to Thebes with his once surviving daughter Ismene and assistant Callias, son of the playwright Theodectes, who has been recruited by Sophocles. Now Oedipus wants to teach the Thebans what he learned in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Nathan and Sophocles travel to Corinth together, and then to Delphi, and then to Thebes. They discuss the life of young Oedipus in Corinth and a sudden journey to the oracle at Delphi, the Pythia, and the entire process of consulting with the Pythia, who transmitted her responses to questions and riddles. In the second act, Oedipus begins to teach a class of young Thebans headed by Alec, a young student. Oedipus, with the help of Ismene and Callias, tells of what he has learned in the time in Jerusalem regarding free will as opposed to fatalism, the Greek moira, and the danger of riddles as opposed to biblical parables. They briefly discuss several destructive riddles emerging in Greek culture. First, a riddle presented to Croesus, the king of Lydia. Second, a riddle deciphered by the Athenian leader Themistocles. Third, Zeno of Elea's construction of the paradox of the race between Achilles and the tortoise. And finally, Homer's riddle, illustrating how Homer's preoccupation with a children's riddle leads to a lack of attention to his actual physical surrounds and his death. In other words, Homer is not in the moment. Oedipus' teaching is complicated by his initially supportive assistant Callias falling in love with Ismene and becoming rivalrous towards Oedipus, who Callias sees as blocking the possibility of his marriage to Ismene. After acting out his jealous anger in class, Callias is now invited to the next class, where Oedipus discusses the story of Samson and how following one's eyes can lead one astray. Sophocles and Nathan invite the Greek chronicler Hesiod and the biblical prophetess Deborah to the subsequent class, and Callias returns. Hesiod discusses the story in the theogony of Cronus cutting off his father's genitals and the conflict between father and son. The prophetess and Judge Deborah, in turn, discusses the story of Abraham circumcising his son Isaac as an alternative to castration and the sign of the father's agreement that the son shall inherit from him, and also God staying Abraham's hand on Mount Moriah as Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac, and also that of Solomon choosing who is the true mother of a live infant and who is the mother of a dead infant in his classic story of the two mothers. Deborah also tells the story of Boaz and Ruth taking in the aging Naomi into their home. This leads to a reconciliation between Callias and Oedipus, where Oedipus accepts Ismene's marriage to Callias, and where Ismene and Callias take Oedipus into their home. Ismene gives birth to a son, Jason, whom Oedipus dotes over as a grandfather, introducing him to a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. The play ends with Callias and Alec excitedly announcing that Oedipus' course has been chosen to be taught in Thebes and the surrounding area, and indeed all of Greece. Oedipus is finally happy. Thank you very much.